There's a flower so dangerous that you can lose your free will without ever realizing it happened. Not metaphorically, not in the way we talk about manipulation or coercion or the slow erosion of someone's judgment over time. Literally, chemically, completely. People who encounter this substance describe waking up hours later, sometimes days later, with no memory of what they did, where they went, or who they spoke to. But the truly disturbing part isn't that they were unconscious. When they weren't, they were awake, they were walking, they were talking, they were opening bank accounts, carrying luggage, letting strangers into their homes. They just had no idea they were doing any of it. And when they came back to themselves, if they came back to themselves, they had no memory of any of it. No crime scene, no struggle, no evidence, sometimes no report. Because some of them still weren't sure anything had happened at all. This is the story of a flower. At a beautiful flower, one that grows in gardens, in parks, along sidewalks and fences in dozens of countries around the world. And this is the story of what some people have done with it. Pay attention. If you saw this plant in someone's garden, you would not be afraid of it. You might stop to look at it. You might even lean in closer. It grows as a shrub or a small tree, sometimes reaching heights of 15, 20 feet. Its branches are wide and drooping, and from those branches hang flowers, long trumpet-shaped flowers, sometimes white, sometimes pale yellow, or soft pink, or a deep salmon orange. They hang downward like bells waiting to be rung, and they are fragrant, extraordinarily fragrant, especially at night when the scent intensifies. Sweet, heady, slightly intoxicating in a way that seems harmless, even pleasant. The plant is called Brugmansia. It belongs to the nightshade family, the same botanical family as tomatoes, potatoes, our eggplant, and tobacco. But unlike those familiar plants, every part of Brugmansia is toxic. The roots, the bark, the leaves, the seeds, the flowers, every single part. It has a long history in the Americas, particularly in the Andes and the Amazon basin, where indigenous communities have understood its properties for centuries. In some ritual contexts, controlled doses were used in ceremonies, in spiritual practices, in rites of passage. Those communities also understood intimately how dangerous it was. There were strict protocols, deep respect, and deep caution. The plant earned common names over the centuries that reflected that caution. Angel's trumpet, moonflower, borrachero, a Spanish word that translates roughly as the drunken one. And then there's the name most people outside those communities know it by now. Devil's breath. Brugmansia was once widespread across South America in the wild. Today, when botanists believe it is extinct in truly wild form, every specimen found is in cultivation, grown by humans, in gardens or farms or along roads. Think about that for a moment. This plant no longer exists in the wild. It only survives because people keep planting it. It is not rare. It is not hidden. You can find it in botanical gardens in Europe, in decorative landscaping in California, in Florida, in parts of the American South, in gardens throughout Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. When in some regions, it lines the roads. It is common. It is beautiful. And most people who pass it every day have no idea what it contains. The flower itself is not the weapon. What the flower contains is, and that is where this story gets darker. Inside the Brugmansia plant, in its roots, its leaves, its seeds, its flowers, there is a class of compounds called tropane alkaloids. You don't need to remember the chemistry. What you need to understand is what they do. And the primary compound is scopolamine. Scopolamine is not obscure. It is a real pharmaceutical compound used in legitimate medicine, in small, carefully controlled doses, in patches placed behind the ear. It treats motion sickness, nausea after surgery, certain vertigo conditions. In those doses, measured in micrograms, fractions of a milligram, it is considered safe. But in higher doses, scopolamine does something else entirely. Think of your brain as a system with two voices. One voice is your conscious mind, the part that plans, decides, evaluates, considers consequences. The part that says, I shouldn't do this. The part that says something feels wrong. The part that says no. The other voice is deeper, more automatic. It follows instructions. It executes actions. It doesn't question. What scopolamine does at elevated doses is silence the first voice. The conscious mind doesn't go to sleep exactly. The body keeps moving. The eyes stay open. Basic communication remains possible. But the filter is gone. The judgment is gone. The resistance is gone. What's left is a person who will do what they are told. This is not metaphor. This is documented pharmacology. Medical literature on scopolamine toxicity describes a consistent constellation of effects at high doses. Anterograde amnesia, the inability to form new memories. Whatever happens during the exposure period will not be stored. There will be nothing to remember later. Not because the person was unconscious, but because the mechanism that converts experience into memory has been switched off. There is also something called heightened suggestibility, a state in which the person becomes highly responsive to external direction. Ask them to stand up, they stand up. Ask them to hand over their belongings, they hand them over. Ask them to walk somewhere, they walk. The critical, evaluating part of the mind that would normally process those instructions, weigh them, refuse them, that part is not functioning. Witnesses who have encountered people in this state describe them as strange in a way that's hard to place, not obviously incapacitated, not stumbling or slurring necessarily, more like absent, compliant, moving and responding, but somehow not fully there, like a person operating on a kind of remote control. One doctor who treated victims in Colombia, a country where these cases have been reported with particular frequency, described the state this way. The patients could walk, could speak, could follow instructions, but showed no affect, no initiative, no resistance. They did what was asked of them. When the drug wore off, they had no memory. Some of them, he said, didn't believe anything had happened to them at all. Because how do you believe in a crime you cannot remember? When there are other compounds in Brugmansia as well, atropine, hyoscyamine, together they compound the effect. They affect heart rate, temperature regulation, perception. At high enough doses, the symptoms escalate to delirium, hallucinations, and eventually, if the dose is large enough, to seizure, to respiratory failure, to death. The margin between a dose that causes compliance and a dose that causes death is not large. Whoever uses this substance in a criminal context is not a careful pharmacist. They are calculating a risk, and the person they are administering it to has no say in that calculation. The use of plants like Brugmansia for criminal purposes is not new. There are historical accounts from colonial-era South America of travelers being robbed after consuming food or drink laced with borrachero extracts. There are records from the 19th century, and the knowledge of what this plant could do And the criminal impulse to exploit that knowledge has existed for as long as the knowledge itself. But something changed in the modern era. As organized crime in South America, particularly in Colombia, grew more sophisticated in the latter half of the 20th century, so did its toolkit. Cocaine was the industry, but the tools for managing people, for extracting compliance, for facilitating crimes that left no witnesses, those tools evolved too. And scopolamine, derived from plants that grew abundantly and cheaply, that required no laboratory, no supply chain, no international trafficking network to obtain, scopolamine became one of those tools. The extraction is reportedly not difficult. The plant is accessible. The compound in crude form can be produced without sophisticated chemistry. And crucially, it leaves almost no trace. By the time a victim wakes up and seeks medical attention, if they seek it at all, yes, the window for reliable toxicological detection may already have closed. The methods of delivery are worth understanding, not to provide a manual, to understand the shape of the threat. The most frequently reported method is the simplest: a drink, a glass of water, a beer, a cocktail. The substance dissolves. It is reportedly odorless, tasteless. The person drinks it without knowing, and within 30 minutes to an hour, the effect begins. But reported cases describe other methods as well. Food, a piece of gum, a cigarette, and in accounts that seem almost theatrical, but have appeared across multiple independent sources over several decades. Paper, a business card, a flyer, a document that has been treated with the compound. Handling it transfers a dose through the skin. Whether every reported method is equally reliable is unclear. Scopolamine is well absorbed through mucous membranes in the digestive tract, or skin absorption is real but less efficient. The theatrical accounts: a woman who blows powder into a man's face, a card that renders its recipient helpless within minutes, may be exaggerated or may reflect a different concentration. But the drink, the food, those methods are straightforward, and the reports are consistent. Investigators in Colombia began documenting what appeared to be an organized pattern in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Victims, frequently tourists, but also local residents, reported waking up disoriented, hours having passed with no memory of what had occurred. Bank accounts had been drained, ATM withdrawals made, apartments cleaned out. Some victims reported being helped to commit the crimes themselves, accompanying strangers to ATMs, opening doors, loading belongings into vehicles, not under threat of force, willingly, without resistance, because the chemical in their system had removed their ability to resist. The criminals behind these schemes understood something important. A victim who cooperates is far easier to manage than one who struggles. There is no scene to clean up, no marks on the victim, no noise, no witnesses to a crime, because the crime doesn't look like a crime. It looks like two people walking together. Colombian authorities at various points have described devil's breath crime as among the most underreported categories of crime in the country. In an emergency room physician in Bogotá, speaking to journalists in the mid-2000s, stated that his hospital was treating multiple scopolamine cases per week, and those were only the cases that made it to his hospital. How many more never arrived? The criminal applications that have been documented, net or credibly alleged, extend beyond simple robbery. Sexual assault, extortion, forced prostitution, coerced financial transactions, signatures obtained on legal documents, e-confessions extracted. In some accounts, the substance has been used against business rivals, to extract information, to coerce agreements, to compromise people in ways that could later be used against them. And there are accounts, unverified but recurring across independent sources, of its use in trafficking, of people being rendered compliant during transport, of the substance being used not once but repeatedly to maintain control over individuals being held against their will. The word zombie gets used in a lot of the journalism around this topic. It's a word that sells stories, but it's also not entirely wrong. A person who moves through the world, who follows instructions, who cooperates with their own exploitation, and who will remember none of it. What other word fits? Establishing specific, verified case details in this area is difficult. That's part of what makes it so disturbing. The nature of the crime, the absence of memory, the willingness of the victim during the act, the rapid dissipation of the compound from the body, makes documentation extraordinarily difficult. Victims often don't report. When they do, the evidence is frequently gone. Police investigations stall. Cases go cold. What we have instead are patterns, and patterns tell their own kind of story. The pattern in Colombia is perhaps the most documented. For decades, investigators, emergency physicians, and journalists have tracked what amounts to an endemic problem in certain urban areas. Bogota, Medellin, Cartagena, a tourist destination where foreign visitors have frequently been targeted. The pattern is consistent, a seemingly friendly encounter. Sometimes a woman, reports suggest women are frequently used as the initial contact because they are less likely to trigger suspicion. A drink is offered, or a cigarette, or the contact simply happens in proximity. The victim within an hour, it becomes compliant. The crime is committed, often over a period of hours. The victim is left somewhere, or simply walks away on their own. They wake up not knowing where they are, or they wake up at home not knowing how they got there, or they don't wake up at all. Among the cases that have been described in reporting over the years, several types recur. A man is approached in a bar or club. He accepts a drink from a stranger. He remembers nothing after the first sip. He is found the next morning sitting in a park. His wallet, his phone, and his bank account, emptied in a sequence of ATM withdrawals, are all gone. He cannot describe his attacker. He cannot describe anything. A woman accepts a ride from a man who seems helpful after she gets lost. She wakes up on a highway outside the city, disoriented, with no memory of the journey and no belongings. She does not go to the police because what would she say? A tourist at a hostel accepts a cigarette from someone they met that afternoon. They remember feeling suddenly strange. Then they remember nothing until they are sitting in a restaurant they do not recognize. Their travel money is gone. Their passport is gone. The hostel staff say they never came back to check in. An account from a local businessman in Colombia reported through the press. He met with a potential partner at a cafe. He has a vague memory of coffee. His next memory is standing outside his own office. Several hours have passed. Inside, a safe has been opened. Documents are missing. He does not know if he opened the safe himself. The cases from Colombia are the most documented, but they are not the only cases. Reports have surfaced in multiple countries, in parts of Western Europe, particularly in cities with high tourism. There are documented cases of scopolamine and related compounds being used in robbery and sexual assault. Some involve drinks in nightlife settings. The same pattern. Others involve encounters that are harder to explain. In the United Kingdom, a number of cases investigated by police involve victims with no memory and significant property losses. In some cases, toxicological testing confirmed the presence of scopolamine. In others, the testing window had closed before the victim sought help. In the United States, the compound has appeared in law enforcement reports, even though cases tend to be sporadic rather than systematic, at least in the documented record. Whether that reflects a lower prevalence, a lower reporting rate, or simply a different investigative focus is an open question. In East Asia, in Southeast Asia, across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are accounts. Less systematic, less documented, harder to trace, but accounts. Once the geography of reported cases maps roughly onto the geography of organized criminal enterprise and of tourist vulnerability. Those two maps overlap in a lot of places. Then there are the cases that don't get reported at all, and that number, the cases no one counted, may be the most important number of all. Why don't victims report? The question sounds simple. The answers are not. First, many victims do not know what happened to them. They wake up confused. They are disoriented, possibly still partially affected. They may not immediately understand that a crime occurred. They may spend days trying to piece together what happened, second-guessing themselves, wondering if they are misremembering. Second, the nature of the crime produces a specific kind of shame. A victim who cooperated, who from the outside appeared to willingly accompany strangers, willingly withdraw money, willingly enter a vehicle, may face skepticism from police, from family, from themselves. The standard question asked of assault victims, "Why didn't you fight back?" takes on a particular cruelty here. The victim didn't fight back because they couldn't conceive of fighting back. The part of their brain that generates resistance had been chemically disabled. But try explaining that to someone who wasn't there. Third, by the time a victim is lucid enough to report, the evidence is often gone. The compound clears the system relatively quickly. Without immediate testing, there is nothing to show. Without memory, there is no description of a suspect. The investigation has nowhere to go. Fourth, in some cases, particularly in regions where the crime is most endemic, there is simply no expectation that reporting will accomplish anything. Why file a report if nothing will happen? Why relive it if there's no chance of justice? If someone were designing a crime from scratch, engineering a method of exploitation that would be as close to undetectable as possible, they might arrive at something that looks a great deal like this. Think about what is normally required to investigate a crime. You need a crime scene, a place where the act occurred, where something was disrupted or disturbed, where evidence was left behind. In a typical robbery or assault, there are marks, fibers, footprints, broken locks, damaged property, DNA. There is something to find. In a scopolamine crime, the crime scene is inside the victim's body, and by the time anyone looks, it's often gone. You need a witness, someone who saw something, heard something, can describe a suspect or a sequence of events. In a typical crime, even in crowds, there are usually witnesses. Someone notices, someone remembers. But a victim who is walking calmly, talking normally, showing no signs of distress, they don't attract attention. No one notices. There are no witnesses. The crime happens in plain sight and no one sees it. You need a victim account. In most crimes, the victim's testimony is the central pillar of investigation. What happened? In what order? What did the perpetrator look like? What did they say? Here, there is no account. Not because the victim is unwilling to cooperate, because there is nothing to report. The memory simply does not exist. You need a suspect, someone to investigate, to connect to the crime, to bring charges against. And when there are no witnesses, no evidence, no victim account, there is also nothing to build a suspect profile from. The perpetrator walks away clean. There is something else that makes this particular crime uniquely difficult to prosecute: the question of consent. A victim who appeared to willingly participate in every stage of the crime presents an evidentiary challenge that goes beyond evidence collection. In cases where security camera footage exists, it may show the victim voluntarily entering a vehicle, voluntarily using an ATM, voluntarily opening a door. From the outside, it looks like consent. It was not consent. But without the ability to demonstrate the presence of the compound, without a victim who can describe what happened, the footage tells a story that is very difficult to argue against. The perpetrator's legal defense, in the rare cases that reach prosecution, is almost self-writing. The victim went willingly. Look at the tape. And then there is perhaps the most insidious element of all: self-doubt. Victims who begin to suspect they were drugged face a particular psychological ordeal. They have no memory. They don't know what happened. They don't know what they said, what they did, whether they behaved in ways they would be ashamed of, whether they were hurt in ways they can't verify, whether the interactions they cannot remember were, in some way they can't define, somehow their fault. The absence of memory is not just an evidentiary problem. It is a psychological wound that doesn't close easily. Some victims describe a lasting paranoia, an inability to accept food or drink from anyone, a withdrawal from social situations, a hypervigilance that is exhausting and isolating, an awareness that the world contains a threat that is invisible, odorless, tasteless, and can be handed to you by someone who is smiling. Others describe a different response: a desperate need to understand what happened, to fill in the blank hours, to know and not knowing. For individual criminal opportunists, the appeal of scopolamine as a tool is clear enough. But what about organized criminal enterprises? What does a compound that removes free will offer to an organization that operates at scale? The short answer is a great deal. A trafficking operation, whether in drugs, in weapons, or in people, require a certain management of assets. Human assets in particular present challenges. People resist, people run, people talk to authorities, people change their minds. A compound that reduces resistance, that makes a person compliant, that suppresses the instinct to flee or fight or refuse, is not just a tool for a single robbery. It is a management solution. Investigators and journalists who have worked in regions where trafficking is endemic have documented accounts of women and men held against their will, who describe repeated exposures to substances that left them confused, compliant, and unable to resist. The descriptions are consistent enough across enough independent accounts to suggest a pattern rather than isolated incidents. The specific chemistry varies. Not every case involves Brugmansia derived scopolamine specifically. There are other compounds in that family. There are synthetic versions. There are pharmaceutical scopolamine products that have been diverted from legitimate supply chains. The specific source matters less than the consistent outcome, compliance without memory. A person who cannot form memories of what they are doing cannot plan an escape, cannot hold a consistent account of where they have been, cannot reliably identify their captors to authorities. Eduai. The intersection with drug trafficking goes further. In some documented cases from Colombia and Ecuador, scopolamine has been found as an adulterant in other illicit drugs, cocaine most commonly. Whether intentionally added by traffickers or introduced at some point in the production chain, the effect is the same. A user who takes what they believe to be cocaine and receives, along with it, a dose of something that makes them temporarily compliant and leaves no memory of what follows. And the implications of that are not pleasant to think through. There have also been documented cases, or credibly alleged ones, of the compound being used in commercial settings. A bar or nightclub where the staff are complicit, drinks routinely dosed, victims taken to ATMs by staff or associates, the operation running for months or years before any investigation. In one account from Colombian press in the early 2000s, a woman arrested in connection with such an operation reportedly told investigators that she could earn the equivalent of several $100s per victim in a single night. And there were many nights. The math of it, the scale of it, is staggering. And those are only the operations that were eventually uncovered. What is harder to trace is the use of the compound in operations that are not primarily about money. Intelligence gathering, coercion, political leverage. And there are historical accounts and more recent allegations of state intelligence services and paramilitary organizations in various countries using scopolamine during interrogations. The idea of a truth serum, a compound that dissolves resistance and loosens the tongue, has a long history in the dark corners of intelligence operations. Whether scopolamine actually functions as a reliable truth serum is, to put it mildly, disputed. A person who is suggestible and amnesiac is not necessarily truthful. They may be easily led to say whatever the interrogator implies they should say, but accurate information may not be the point. Compliance might be. Silence afterward might be. A signature on a document, witnessed by no one who will speak about it, might be. The documented cases cluster in certain places. Colombia, as mentioned, has the densest reporting. For reasons that are partly geographical, Brugmansia grows abundantly there, and partly institutional. Colombia has had investigative journalists and medical professionals willing to document this phenomenon for decades. But clustering of reports doesn't mean clustering of cases. It may mean clustering of documentation. Consider a crime that leaves no physical evidence, produces no reliable victim account, and often goes unreported entirely. How would you detect it? What data would you look at? What numbers would tell you how common it was? The honest answer is that you largely can't, not directly. What investigators and public health officials sometimes look for are proxies. Emergency room presentations with signs consistent with anticholinergic toxicity, which is what scopolamine poisoning produces, that lack an obvious explanation. Patterns of crime that fit the signature, robbery or assault with no physical evidence, victims unable to account for their time, financial losses that map to ATM transactions over a several-hour window. When you look for those proxies, the picture that emerges is wider than the reported cases suggest. Not just Colombia, not just South America, Eastern Europe has reported patterns consistent with scopolamine crime, particularly in tourist areas and nightlife settings. Not the specific compound detected in some cases has been related drugs rather than scopolamine itself, variations on the same pharmacological family. In some Gulf states, reports have emerged of tourist victims presenting at hospitals with unexplained memory gaps and financial losses, consistent with drug-facilitated robbery. The pattern of tourist targeting is notable and consistent across regions. Tourists carry cash and cards. Tourists are often unfamiliar with the environment, making them easier to manipulate spatially, to take somewhere, to lead somewhere. Tourists are less likely to report crimes in a foreign country, and tourists, if they do report, are likely to leave before any investigation matures. From a criminal's perspective, a tourist is a nearly ideal target. There is a separate question about who else might be a target. Not tourists, not strangers in bars, people who are known, business competitors, estranged spouses, when employees with leverage over an employer, witnesses to crimes, journalists, investigators. If you wanted to access someone's home, their files, their safe, their computer, and you needed their cooperation to do it, and you were willing to take the risk of using this compound on someone close enough to you to have an ongoing relationship with, how many of those crimes would ever be recognized as crimes at all? This is the point in the story where it would be comfortable to offer some answers. To say, here is how widespread this really is. Here is the actual scale of the problem. Here is what authorities are doing. Here is how you protect yourself. Some of those things can be said partially, but the honest framing of this story requires acknowledging what cannot be said. How common is criminal scopolamine use globally? No one knows. This is not a hedge. It is an accurate statement. The data infrastructure to answer this question does not exist. There is no international reporting system that collects cases of drug-facilitated crime by compound. There is no coordination between the Colombian hospital that sees 3 cases a week and the European city that sees 1 a month and the Southeast Asian tourist district where no cases are formally documented at all. The cases that are counted are a fraction of the cases that occur. How large that fraction is, 1 in 10, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, is genuinely unknown. How much of what is reported about Devil's Breath is real, and how much is myth or exaggeration? This is a harder question. There is no doubt that scopolamine poisoning with criminal intent exists and has been documented. There is toxicological proof. There are prosecutions. There are hospital records. The core phenomenon is real, but around the real phenomenon, a penumbra of unverified accounts has gathered over the years. The stories get more extreme as they travel. The business card that incapacitates on touch, the perfume bottle sprayed in a crowd, the single exposure that gives an attacker total control for days. Some of these accounts may be accurate. Some may be embellished. Some may be fabrications. The compound's real pharmacological properties are dramatic enough that embellishment isn't necessary. But embellishment happens anyway. That's especially as stories move through media channels that reward the extraordinary. What that means practically is that the truth about Devil's Breath may be simultaneously less cinematic than some accounts suggest and more widespread than official data implies. The reality is probably less spectacular than the legend, and also more common than the reports. Why does this remain so poorly studied? Here the questions become uncomfortable in a different way. A crime that primarily targets poor travelers in developing countries, that disproportionately affects women, that carries built-in barriers to reporting. This is not a crime that has historically attracted significant research investment. The victims are not on average the people who determine research priorities. There is also a pharmacological complexity that makes some of the published work less reliable than it appears. Where studies of drug-facilitated crime often rely on self-reported data, which in cases involving amnesia-inducing compounds is inherently limited. Detection windows are short. Hospitals in high-incidence regions often lack the equipment for specific toxicological screening. The data that exists was collected inconsistently and incomparably across jurisdictions. What we have is not the story, it is a glimpse of the edge of the story. Are there victims right now who experience something like this and still don't know what happened to them? Almost certainly. People who woke up confused on a morning they can't account for and told themselves they must have had too much to drink. People who noticed money missing from their accounts and assumed they'd spent it and forgotten. People who came home with no memory of the hours after a social encounter and put it down to stress, exhaustion, or a blackout they attributed to alcohol. Some portion of those people experience something else entirely, and they may never know. Most criminal scopolamine cases end with the victim alive, traumatized, robbed, violated in ways that may take years to process, but alive, not all of them. The margin between a dose that causes compliance and a dose that causes death has already been mentioned. In a controlled medical setting, scopolamine is administered in micrograms. Yet in a criminal context, it is administered by someone who has no medical training, who is not monitoring the victim's condition, who may not know precisely what concentration they are using, and who has no particular incentive to keep the dose safe. Overdose from anticholinergic compounds causes a specific constellation of symptoms: rapid heart rate, hyperthermia, agitation, seizure, and eventually cardiac and respiratory failure. It can occur quickly, and it is not always recognized for what it is. Emergency room physicians in regions with high exposure to these crimes have noted that some presentations initially diagnosed as cardiac events, heat stroke, or drug overdoses of other kinds may actually represent anticholinergic toxicity, including scopolamine. In a system that is not specifically looking for it, in a victim who cannot provide a history, the cause may be missed. There is no registry of deaths attributable to criminal scopolamine administration. The deaths that occur in this context do not leave behind records that identify them. They disappear into other categories. And then there are the disappearances themselves. In regions where trafficking using compliance-inducing compounds has been alleged, some of the people affected are not robbery victims who eventually wake up. They are people who don't come back at all. The link between chemical compliance and human trafficking is not theoretical. It is attested in survivor accounts, in prosecutorial filings, in reports from international anti-trafficking organizations. The compound is not the trafficking operation. The trafficking operation is the trafficking operation. But the compound makes the operation easier, quieter, more controllable. When a person is moved against their will, normally there are signs of struggle, and there are witnesses to an abduction. There is a moment of resistance that someone might notice or remember. When the person moves of their own volition, compliant, uncomplaining, appearing to anyone watching like a person simply traveling somewhere with people they know, there is nothing to notice, nothing to remember, nothing to investigate. A woman reported missing in a city where these cases are endemic may have been trafficked, or she may have walked out of her hotel carrying her own luggage. She may not have known she was leaving. Why has the problem been so difficult to address institutionally? Not in the way of asking for blame, but in trying to understand the structural reasons why a crime this prevalent in certain regions, at certain times, never becomes the subject of a coordinated international response. Start with reporting barriers. The same factors that prevent individual victims from reporting: shame, disorientation, lack of evidence, distrust of institutions, aggregate at scale into a reporting data set that is almost meaningless for policy purposes. You cannot design a law enforcement response to a problem whose contours you cannot measure. Add to that the jurisdictional complexity. The victim may be a foreign national. The crime may have occurred in one district, the financial harm in another. The perpetrators may operate across borders. The compound itself crosses borders as part of legitimate pharmaceutical supply chains. No single agency owns this problem, and when no single agency owns a problem, the default response is often to note the problem's existence and continue. Add to that the economic dynamics. In regions where this crime is most concentrated, law enforcement capacity is often stretched. Homicide, drug violence, organized crime at scale, these command resources. A robbery that leaves no evidence and whose victim may not report rarely climbs to the top of a prioritization list. And add to that, finally, the cultural dimension. In some of the regions where Devil's Breath crime has been most documented, there is a community of knowledge, a shared awareness among residents that this is a real risk, that there are bars and streets and situations to avoid, that certain offers should never be accepted. This knowledge is passed informally, a person to person, in the way that community knowledge always travels. What this means is that the burden of protection has, by default, fallen on potential victims rather than on systems or institutions. Be careful. Don't accept drinks from strangers. Know what neighborhoods to avoid. This is not a solution. It is a displacement, the absence of a solution dressed up as one. Before closing this story, it is worth pausing on the mythology, because the mythology matters. It matters both because it distorts our understanding of a real problem and because myths about crime sometimes cause harm of their own. The image of Devil's Breath that circulates most widely in popular media is the most extreme version, a substance so powerful that a single breath incapacitates instantly, renders the victim totally controlled, and can be administered through almost any means without the perpetrator even touching them. This version is somewhat different from what the pharmacology and the documented cases actually describe. Real scopolamine poisoning takes time to develop, typically 30 minutes to an hour after ingestion. It does not produce total, cinematic obedience in which the victim robotically follows every instruction. It produces suggestibility, disorientation, memory impairment, and reduced resistance, real and genuinely dangerous, but not the remote control zombie of the popular imagination. When the more extreme accounts, instantaneous incapacitation, control through skin contact, complete behavioral domination, are almost certainly embellishments or conflations with other substances, or simply untrue. Why does the myth grow? Partly because extreme stories travel, partly because the real phenomenon is alarming enough that embellishment feels natural. If the real thing is bad, the worst-case version feels like appropriate warning. But there is also a darker possibility. Some of the myth is useful to certain parties. An urban legend that circulates among tourists That any contact with any stranger in Bogota carries the risk of instant chemical enslavement is an exaggeration that affects how people perceive entire cities and entire populations. It has economic consequences. It has social consequences. The real crime is serious enough. The real crime affects real people in ways that are genuinely devastating. It does not need amplification to be worth taking seriously, but amplification has happened, and amplification has its own costs. There is also a subtler distortion worth naming. The framing of Devil's Breath crime, when it does appear in Western media, tends to center the tourist, the foreign visitor, the person who came from somewhere else and was targeted. The victims who are not tourists don't appear in those stories. The local residents in Bogota and Medellin were in the neighborhoods where this crime is endemic, who are targeted not because they are exotic or foreign, but simply because they are there and they have something someone wants. They are largely absent from the international narrative. Their cases are also the ones with the least documentation, the least follow-through, the least institutional response. Who the story is told for matters, who it's told about also matters, and who it's not told about matters most. Ehornam, there are things we know. Brugmansia is real. Scopolamine is real. Its pharmacological effects are real and documented. Criminal use of this compound, through the digestive tract, through contaminated food and drink, in organized patterns that suggest intentional deployment by criminal networks, is real and has been documented over decades by investigators, physicians, journalists, and law enforcement. There are things we don't know. The actual scale of this problem, whether the cases we can count represent 10% of total incidents or 1% or less. Which of the deaths in regions of high prevalence are related to this compound and have simply been classified as something else? What the full geography of its criminal use looks like. How many people are living with an unexamined blank spot in their memory that contains a crime they never knew was committed against them? And there are things we cannot know, not with current data, and then not without a transformation in how these crimes are reported, detected, and investigated that shows no signs of occurring. What we're left with is a shape in the dark, a phenomenon that is real and persistent and largely invisible, that has existed for decades and has not been meaningfully reduced. That affects people who are poor and people who are wealthy, people in the global south and in Western cities, are tourists who made the mistake of accepting a drink and residents who were targeted in the ordinary course of their lives. And a flower, pendulous white blooms hanging downward in the evening air, fragrant, beautiful, unthreatening in every visible way. The question this story leaves with, and there is no satisfying answer to it, is a question about invisibility. How many things are hiding like this? In plain sight, in gardens, in ordinary social encounters, or in moments that look exactly like moments that are harmless because no one who passed by had any reason to look closer. We have built our sense of safety on what we can see, on signs of threat that register as threat, on the assumption that danger announces itself. But some dangers don't announce themselves. Some dangers are beautiful. Some dangers smell like something you want to lean toward. Some dangers are already in the drink in your hand. It grows in gardens, when on sidewalks, along fences, in public parks, in ornamental plantings outside hotels and restaurants and apartment complexes in dozens of countries on several continents. Most people who walk past it every day don't know its name. They notice the flowers, the long white trumpets hanging down, the sweet, heavy fragrance. They might stop to look. They might lean in closer. And then they move on with no reason to be afraid. Because most of the time, nearly all of the time, the flower is just a flower. And the rest of the time, you might not know the difference until it's far too late to matter. The most dangerous things in the world don't look dangerous. They look like something you'd stop to admire. According to Colombian health authorities, scopolamine-related crimes are considered among the most underreported in the country. The exact global prevalence remains unknown. If this story made you think, like subscribe and share it with someone who should know.